Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare a recess of the committee at any time. As a reminder, members participating in a hearing remotely should be visible on camera throughout the hearing. As with in-person meetings, members are responsible for controlling their own microphones. Members can be muted by staff only to avoid inadvertent background noise. And I'd like to remind members that per the guidance of the attending physician, members, staff, and all members physically present, including in this hearing room, are required to wear masks unless seeking or under recognition by the chair. In addition, statements, documents, or motions must be submitted to the electronic repository, scccc.repository@mail.house.gov. Finally, members and witnesses experiencing technical problems should inform committee staff immediately. Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining this hybrid hearing on the international climate challenges and opportunities. Today, we will hear about the challenges and opportunities for international climate action as we prepare for the COP, the Conference of Parties 26, about to commence in Glasgow, Scotland. And I'll now recognize myself for a 5-minute opening statement. First of all, thank you, everyone, for joining us today. We are at a very exciting inflection point for our country and for the planet. We now know that we are on the cusp of the most historic investment in clean energy and climate action that has ever been part of U.S. politics. Our economy is going to move forward through creating jobs, providing opportunities, but also addressing the very costly impacts of the climate crisis. It appears now that we are poised to vote on a Build Back Better plan that will help us combat climate change for all American families. And just as a summary, President Biden just left a meeting of the Democratic caucus where he outlined a lot of what is in that framework. What we know now is that that framework will cut greenhouse gas pollution by well over 1 gigaton by 2030, reduce consumer energy costs, give our kids cleaner air and water, create hundreds of thousands of high-quality jobs, and advance environmental justice by investing in a 21st century clean energy economy. From buildings to transportation to industry to electricity and agricultural smart practices all across this country. It will help restore America's leadership role in the world. But we have a lot to do heading into Glasgow. Climate change is a global crisis. According to a recent study, the climate crisis impacts more than 85% of the world's population. And although every country is impacted differently, it's clear we've got to work together to solve it. We have to choose a path forward. One path is paved with inadequate action, which will lead to continued destruction as we kick the can down the road. But we're not going to do that. There is a brighter path, and it's paved with generational investments in renewable energy, electric vehicles, environmental justice, and climate resilience. And it leads us to a net zero emissions world, one in which future generations will thrive. We have a moral obligation to our kids and future generations to do this now. And the United States has a special responsibility to lead the world down this path through our example. See, and this chart tells a story. The United States has emitted more CO2 than any other country in history. And we're also going to lead the world in the solutions, in the answers. The upcoming COP26 will serve as a vital test. When global leaders meet in Glasgow next week, almost every nation around the world, including big polluters like China, will be challenged to increase their climate ambitions. President Biden is on his way there, he just told us, to help lead the world on those solutions. This year, the president has already pledged to slash America's greenhouse gas emissions in half by 2030. And as COP26 starts next week, it's up to us in Congress to help achieve that goal. In this committee, we've focused on these solutions. We've talked about the opportunity to create millions of good-paying jobs, to protect the health of our children and safeguard our economy, and of our imperative to ensure environmental justice for communities of color and tribes. And today we're going to focus on those international benefits that come with solving the climate crisis, because not only will reducing pollution make life better for families here in America, it will also strengthen our partnerships abroad as we work with other nations to do the same. But there are major challenges to international cooperation. The overarching one is straightforward. How do we keep global temperatures from continuing to rise? We can start by making those generational investments in clean energy, powering our homes with renewables, and expanding our use of zero emissions technologies. But we know we cannot do this alone. Another challenge is the need to invest in adaptation, because while cutting carbon pollution is critical, we must also focus on helping communities adapt to climate impacts that are already here. Without expanded adaptation and resilience, we'll continue to see suffering, not only in America, but across the globe, especially in low and moderate income communities. That's why we must invest in measures that will help families prepare today, while also reducing the risk of broader instability. Climate action gives us an opportunity to transform our world for the better. The upcoming climate conference reminds us all that we're all fighting the same fight. By the power of America's example, we will lead the world and rise to this challenge. We simply don't have another choice. At this time, I'll recognize Ranking Member Graves for a 5-minute opening statement.
Hey, thanks, Madam Chair. Appreciate the hearing today, and I want to thank our witnesses for joining us. I share the chair's objective of moving in a direction of even lower emissions and clean energy transition. Unfortunately, as I sit here and listen to the opening statement, I got to tell you, I feel that might be about where our views, our common views end, unfortunately. Madam Chair, I feel that we have got to be a bit more candid about reality. We have got to be a bit more candid about what is going on in the world today, what has gone on in the world in recent years in regard to strategies that have worked and strategies that haven't. Madam Chair, we're seeing right now record energy prices, escalation in prices in energy that's affecting every single American. It's costing people more to fuel their cars. It's costing people more to heat and cool their homes. And let's be really clear. This is absolutely positively the result of actions and inactions of this administration. I can't even begin to explain to people at home, nor should I even try to, how in the world it can be that our administration, our White House of America, the leaders of this country are out there facilitating projects like the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, facilitating Russian dirtier energy into the European Union. And at the same time, shutting down the exact same types of projects in the United States, where this administration leading this American country, the leaders of our 330 plus million citizens are out there saying, you can't produce domestic energy, conventional fuels, yet going in the same breath to Russia, to Saudi Arabia, to Venezuela, to Nigeria, to Iran, and saying, we would like for you to increase the production of the very resources we're preventing from being produced in the United States. Madam Chair, I want to see our president treat Americans the same way that he is generously treating citizens of other countries. I don't get it, and it doesn't make sense. And American citizens are paying the price today. And as every hearing is, as we sit here and listen to folks demonize the United States, this is the 26th COP, the 26th COP. And you know what? Global emissions are still going up. If people in our office failed 26 times, they would have had a pink slip long ago. It is not okay for us to be out there in this global stage talking about all of these commitments that disproportionately penalize the United States economy, that are extraordinary deviations from the very strategies that have resulted in the United States being the global leader in reducing emissions. And sitting there as we have in testimony today, propping up countries like China. And it's fascinating to me seeing letters written by environmental communities saying things like, we're deeply troubled by the growing Cold War mentality driving the United States approach to China, an antagonistic posture that risks undermining much needed climate cooperation. Let me ask you how we're supposed to act whenever you have a country that lies about what's going on with a global pandemic, that in the same breath they're telling the World Health Organization nothing's going on, that they're buying billions of pieces of masks and gloves that were manufactured in China and previously sold to other countries and buying it back into China so their citizens have protection and so they can then price gouge the rest of the world on the same PPE. How are we supposed to treat a country that has gone out there and stolen through cyber attacks, intellectual property, innovation of Americans? How are we supposed to treat a country that has gone out there and illegal trade practices, dumping products on the US economy, killing jobs, affecting millions and millions of jobs in the United States? Are we supposed to be nice to these folks? The country that is increasing emissions 4 tons for every 1 ton we're reducing in the United States. Madam Chair, as the United States has led the world in reducing emissions, the global community has increased tenfold for every ton we've reduced. Let me say it again. You can look at the strategies in Europe as a great example for us. California is a great example for us. We can either follow strategies that work, or we can continue to do what y'all are trying to do right now, manipulating technologies, taking options away from innovators, and at the end of the day, resulting in higher emissions, resulting in higher prices. It's a flawed approach, and we have the evidence to prove it. It's irresponsible for us to continue in this direction. Yield back.
Without objection, members who wish to enter opening statements into the record have 5 business days to do so. Now I'd like to welcome our witnesses. We'll hear from experts on the challenges and opportunities for international climate action as world leaders prepare to gather in Glasgow for COP26. First, Taryn Franson is a senior fellow at the World Resources Institute Global Climate Program, where she focuses on long-term climate strategies and nationally determined contributions with the view of leveraging these and other policy instruments in support of rapid decarbonization. In 2018, Taryn served as a senior policy advisor on the Global Climate Action Summit for the Office of the Governor of California, and prior to that, she led WRI's Open Climate Network, a coalition focusing on countries' commitments under the Paris Agreement. The chair now recognizes Representative Bonamici to introduce Jada Joanne McKenna.
Thank you, Chair Castor. It's my pleasure to introduce Ms. Jada Joanne McKenna, Chief Executive Officer of Mercy Corps, which is headquartered in Portland, Oregon, just a few blocks from the congressional district I represent. Ms. McKenna leads a global team of more than 5,400 humanitarians who provide immediate relief to save lives and livelihoods in more than 40 countries, reaching 37 million people. Previously, she served as Chief Operating Officer of CARE, where she oversaw the organization's programming and global operations. I want to thank Ms. McKenna for spending time with the committee this morning and for providing her organization's important perspective. I look forward to hearing more about the important work Mercy Corps is doing, in particular, its efforts to increase climate and disaster resilience in vulnerable communities around the world. Thank you, Chair Castor, and I yield back.
Next is Charles Hernick. He's the Vice President of Policy and Advocacy at Citizens for Responsible Energy Solutions Forum, where he leads policy work and executes strategies to advance clean energy solutions and innovative approaches to reducing carbon emissions. Charles has decades of experience working in economic development, energy, and natural resource management across the United States and on the ground in dozens of countries. Next, Alden Meyer is a senior associate at E3G working on United States and international climate policy and politics. He is a principal at Performance Partners, which provides a range of consulting services to clients in government, business, and the nonprofit sector. Alden has more than 4 decades of experience on environmental and energy issues and is an expert on the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, the Paris Agreement, and other aspects of international climate policy. Without objection, the witnesses' written statements will be made part of the record. With that, Ms. Franson, you are now recognized to give a 5-minute presentation of your testimony. Welcome.
Chair Castor, Ranking Member Graves, and members of the committee, thank you for inviting me to testify. My name is Taryn Franson, and I'm a senior fellow in the climate program at the World Resources Institute, a nonprofit, nonpartisan environmental think tank. My work focuses on greenhouse gas pathways and targets. You asked me to testify regarding how we can get on track to limit climate change to less dangerous levels. Before I do that, I want you to know where I'm coming from. On Sunday, I sat in the dark to write this testimony as an atmospheric river knocked out power to my house. 2 months ago, on the day my nephew was supposed to start kindergarten in South Lake Tahoe, he was instead in a car heading north to flee the Caldor fire. We watched the fire perimeter hour by hour to see whether he would have a home to return to. These are climate impacts. They are hurting Americans today, and they pale in comparison to what less fortunate communities face. We are out of time for excuses. So, there are 3 points I hope you will take from my testimony. First, policies being implemented by countries around the world today put us on track for warming of 2.8 degrees Celsius or 5 degrees Fahrenheit. That is too high. It's dangerous. Second, to change that trajectory, we need to cut emissions in half by 2030. That means rapidly transforming the systems that propel our economy, like power generation, industry, transport, and agriculture. We know what changes we need to make, and we stand to benefit from those changes. Third, this Congress is facing a once-in-a-generation opportunity to change the course of history by passing strong climate investments as part of the Build Back Better Act and the Bipartisan Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. Let's look at where we're headed today. Global greenhouse gas emissions grew 1.3% per year over the last decade to reach a record high in 2019. While the recent downturn shaved a few percentage points off 2020 emissions, they're already bouncing back, and this year's emissions are expected to match pre-pandemic levels. But to get on the least cost pathway to limit warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius, we need to cut emissions in half over the next 9 years. Under current policies, we are on track to experience warming of around 2.8 degrees Celsius or 5 degrees Fahrenheit. If we factor in the additional targets that countries are setting for 2030 under the Paris Agreement, which aren't yet backed up by policies, we'll do a little better. And if countries like the US and China that have set net zero emissions targets manage to meet them, we'll be on track for 2 degrees Celsius or 4 degrees Fahrenheit. But even that is too much. Temperatures to date have risen less than half that amount, and scientists say that warming was responsible for the devastating heat wave that killed hundreds in the Pacific Northwest this summer. It also increased the likelihood of storms like Hurricane Ida by 2 to 3 times, taking lives and causing billions in damage. We know what we need to do to get on a different path. A report launched today by WRI and its partners identifies 40 key benchmarks that we need to meet over the next decade in order to avoid the worst climate impacts. To name just a few, by 2030, we need to increase the share of electric vehicles in light-duty vehicle sales to between 75 and 95%, phase out public financing for fossil fuels, and increase crop yields by 18%. We're not starting from a standstill. We are moving in the right direction, but too slowly, and we need to accelerate dramatically. As the world's largest economy, the United States has the ability to do just that. And because we've emitted more carbon than any other country, we have the obligation to do so. We took a strong step by committing to cut emissions in half by 2030. This target is ambitious and achievable, but it will not implement itself. Congress should do 3 things to help. First, Congress should pass ambitious legislation to cut emissions in line with our commitment. Second, Congress should position the US to help drive emission reductions globally. One important avenue is to ramp up bipartisan support for international funding for clean energy, forest protection, and resilience. Finally, further innovation can broaden our options for driving net emissions down to 0. Therefore, Congress should ramp up RD&D funding for clean technologies. We can't pick and choose among these steps. We need to do them all. And fortunately, they will benefit Americans. Reducing emissions means advancing clean, efficient energy and ecosystem restoration, which create more US jobs per dollar invested than the fossil fuel sector. Supporting climate finance abroad improves our national security and helps US business benefit from the $23 trillion low carbon investment opportunity in emerging markets. We have a long way to go to address this crisis. A wide range of policies can help us get there, but we need ambitious legislation and we don't have time to waste. Ultimately, Congress will be judged not on the specific measures it deploys, but on the extent to which it acts quickly to place the country on a just and equitable path to meet its climate targets. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Franson. Ms. McKenna, you are recognized for 5 minutes to provide your testimony.
Thank you. Good morning, and thank you, Committee Chair Castor, Ranking Member Graves, and members of the House Select Committee on the Climate Crisis. My name is Jada Doyen McKenna, and I am the Chief Executive Officer of Mercy Corps, an international humanitarian and development organization. As was mentioned earlier, our global team of 5,400 humanitarians operates in 40 countries, where our work supports more than 37 million people, including to adapt to a changing climate. One of our flagship programs is providing services and products by mobile phone to 3 million farmers across 7 countries to help them improve climate-informed agriculture practices, from planting drought-resistant seeds to accessing innovative financial services. While climate change affects every country on every continent, its effects are not shared equally. People already burdened by poverty, violence, and hunger suffer the harshest consequences while having the least ability to cope. Climate change is one of the main drivers of the global hunger crisis. Global hunger has been dramatically rising over the past 5 years, and today, roughly 155 million people are experiencing acute food insecurity. Extreme weather events are reducing harvest, raising food prices, driving migration, and generating new conflicts, contributing to the reversal of years of gains in income growth and food security. We have effective tools for solving hunger, but we now need to build climate change adaptation into that equation. For example, in Guatemala, where rising temperatures have contributed to long periods of drought, crop loss, and low food production, Mercy Corps has partnered with Colorado State University to leverage its predictive weather modeling expertise to help farmers make more informed decisions about planting, harvesting, and storing. And in Nepal, where changing weather has led to severe crop losses, we have helped farmers increase their yields by 61% through new climate-smart agriculture practices. Climate change is a threat multiplier, sparking violence and conflict. Our teams see firsthand how interconnected conflict and climate change are. For instance, in the Eastern Democratic Republic of the Congo, while climate change affects every country on every continent, its effects are not shared equally. In the Democratic Republic of Congo, our FORM program provided community members with negotiations and dispute resolution training, empowering them to work with local authorities to establish a new land access and leasing program for thousands of small-scale farmers. Unfortunately, the communities that need the most help are being left behind as the most fragile countries are passed over for safer options. Only 25% of bilateral climate financing and less than 50% of major multilateral funding targets countries most vulnerable to climate change. And in 2019, less than 1% of climate adaptation funding went to the 10 most fragile states. It is possible to reverse the trend. Mercy Corps has helped millions of people worldwide adapt to a changing climate, sowing drought-resistant crops in Ethiopia, using state-of-the-art technology to cope with flooding in Nepal, and distributing drought-resistant seeds to boost harvests in Haiti. But we need the help of donors, including the US government. First, it is vital to recognize that communities urgently need help to adapt to the changing climate. It is too late to focus solely on reducing emissions. The US government can demonstrate leadership by increasing resources dedicated to its climate adaptation accounts, particularly for the US Agency for International Development. I was pleased to see the increase for climate adaptation funding in the pending fiscal year 2022 state and foreign ops appropriation bills, and I hope the House of Representatives will match the Senate's more generous proposal. I also urge the United States to galvanize private sector investment in sustainable climate finance. Second, the U.S. government must ensure that its assistance is going to the most climate vulnerable places, and particularly to those that are conflict affected. Adaptation efforts should be locally led, include a strong investment in digital infrastructure, and have a special focus on smallholder farmers, especially women and young people. Lastly, U.S. climate adaptation assistance should build on and reinforce our other development assistance to prevent conflict, hunger, and poverty. I thank this select committee for its commitment to helping vulnerable communities adapt to climate change, and I look forward to questions later. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Hernick, you're recognized for 5 minutes. Welcome.
Thank you, Chair Castor, Ranking Member Graves, and members of the committee. I appreciate the opportunity to testify today. My name is Charles Hernick. I'm Vice President of Policy and Advocacy with an organization called Citizens for Responsible Energy Solutions. My testimony today is shaped not just by my experience here in the United States, but on the ground in over a dozen countries in Africa and Latin America. I hope you remember 3 points from my testimony today. The first is that there is no substitute for U.S. leadership in innovation. The second is that trade and aid must drive economic growth and opportunity, not just on the ground in the countries we're assisting, but here in the United States. And finally, and in the spirit of Halloween, to remember that greenhouse gases are the boogeyman, not fossil fuels. With respect to innovation, low cost, low emission technologies and goods will be successful to climate policy. Anything short of widespread adoption will fail to address the global issue. American innovations will be a key driver, and people all around the world are looking for the next 3M or General Mills, the next Ford or Tesla, the next IBM or Apple, to develop and deploy quality consumer products around the world. In our climate conscious era, quality means low carbon, zero carbon, or net negative emissions technologies. That's why the most important role for the United States government is to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by making strategic investments in innovation, research and development, such as those included in the Energy Act of 2020, which serves as a strong foundation for an all-of-the-above approach, focusing on renewables, nuclear, fossil fuel and energy efficiency, hydrogen, electrification, and carbon capture, utilization, and storage. All of these options must be on the table. With respect to trade and aid, the United States leads the world in development assistance. We should be proud of that fact and continue our global commitments. But more important than the dollars of the direct aid is America's role in cultivating the right outcome: economic growth, a low carbon future, and strong ties with our democratic allies around the world. That means also assuring that U.S. solutions are brought to the world through international trade policy at a cost that the developing nations are able and willing to pay. U.S. government must harness the power of free markets and be champions of free markets as we re-examine our regulations, trade, and intellectual property protections. That means avoiding mandates and subsidies. We live in an era where even in the depths of a pandemic, companies large and small have voluntarily committed to carbon neutrality by mid-century. Government should empower companies to achieve their self-set goals, not pursue heavy-handed top-down mandates that drive up costs and reduce options, not just here in the US, but around the world. With respect to greenhouse gases, we need to remember that the data matter. Coal, oil, and natural gas are indispensable to the global energy system and the global economy. In 1971, coal, oil, and natural gas fueled 86% of the global energy supply. In 2019, this decreased only slightly to 81%. I'm a champion of renewables, and I'm very proud of the fact that renewables have been able to grow in the United States at over 11% last year in the depths of a pandemic. But when you look at the globe, the energy mix is pretty stable. Dramatic re-engineering of the global energy system hasn't happened, and while it's possible, it's not likely to happen in the next decade. That's why we need to acknowledge that U.S. oil and gas is far cleaner than equivalent fuels from anywhere else in the world. For example, Russian-produced natural gas shipped by pipeline to Europe has about 41% higher life cycle emissions than U.S. liquefied natural gas shipped to the same destination. Russian-produced natural gas shipped by pipeline to China has 47% higher life cycle emissions than US LNG. When a resource is taken off the table, innovation in that area will grind to a halt. That's why Congress should continue to support carbon capture, utilization, and storage. Government does not need to mandate that these technologies be adopted. Companies are doing it on their own. Completely cutting out fossil fuels in the short term is simply not realistic. And given the high percentage of the energy mix that they still provide, we need to keep all options on the table. Finally, there's a significant security concern with targeting US fuels in our current global marketplace. America calling on OPEC to increase production undercuts our economic and national security objectives. Policies that restrict US fossil fuel production, transportation, and exports in the name of climate change actually have the opposite effect. They contribute more to global emissions, not less, at a significant cost to America's reputation, security, and economic outlook. Thank you for your time, and I look forward to questions.
Thank you. Mr. Meyer, you're recognized for 5 minutes. Welcome.
Thank you, Chair Castor, Ranking Member Graves, and members of the Select Committee. My name is Alden Meyer, and I'm a Senior Associate with E3G, Third Generation Environmentalism. I very much appreciate the opportunity to testify before you today. I've been asked to discuss what needs to be accomplished at the COP26 summit in Glasgow that starts on Sunday, and what are the prospects for success. As you've just heard from Ms. Franson, we already know that we will leave Glasgow with a huge gap between the collective level of ambition in the commitments countries have put forward under the Paris Agreement and what's required to keep 1.5 degrees alive and avoid the worst impacts of climate change. In Glasgow, countries must acknowledge the need to increase ambition over the remainder of this decade and set out a process and deadline to make that happen. On climate finance, it's good that developed countries have finally shown how they intend to meet their commitment to mobilize $100 billion annually in finance for mitigation and adaptation activities in developing countries out to 2025. But more work is needed to scale up finance for adaptation and to improve access to finance for smaller, vulnerable countries. Countries also must agree at COP26 on the process and timeline for negotiating the goal for mobilizing even more climate finance after 2025. We already know that sums much greater than $100 billion a year are required to help developing countries such as India, Indonesia, and South Africa make the transition from fossil fuels to clean energy resources. If the US and other G7 countries are able to show how the Build Back Better for the World initiative launched at their G7 summit in June will deliver clean infrastructure investments at the scale needed, it would help persuade some of the major developing countries to support the ambition accelerator language that we need in the final COP decision. As Ms. McKenna just told you, many countries and communities are suffering from a range of devastating climate-related impacts, which will continue to mount over the next several decades, even if we succeed in meeting the Paris Agreement temperature limitation goals. Vulnerable countries are calling for much faster progress on mobilizing financial resources to help address the economic losses and the severe damage to lives and livelihoods that their citizens are experiencing as a result of climate impacts. How far we can get towards agreement in Glasgow that start to meet these needs remains to be seen. Agreement on the rules for market mechanisms under Article 6 of the Paris Agreement is an important objective for COP26, as is ensuring transparency on how well countries are doing in meeting their Paris commitments, both on constraining domestic emissions and on providing finance for developing country action. Bringing China and other major developing countries closer to parity with developing nations on a robust reporting regime has been an objective of both Democratic and Republican US administrations throughout the history of the climate negotiations. Climate change and health issues are the driving themes for the G20 Leader Summit that will take place in Rome this Saturday and Sunday. Italy's Prime Minister Mario Draghi will be pressing other leaders to agree on the need for more ambitious action between now and 2030 and for commitments to phase down coal consumption and to eliminate subsidies for fossil fuel production and use. If he can forge consensus on these issues, it will provide important impetus for progress in Glasgow. Let me conclude by discussing three possible scenarios for the outcomes of COP26. A good outcome would see agreement on the need for more action to close the ambition gaps on reducing emissions, on increasing climate finance for both mitigation and adaptation, and finance to address loss and damage. Environmental integrity would be prioritized in the Article 6 rules, and a strong transparency framework would be agreed upon. The slew of announcements made in Glasgow by governments, companies, and investors on sectoral initiatives to cut emissions would send strong signals on the irreversibility of the shift from fossil fuels to a clean energy economy. A disappointing outcome would see no agreement on ways to close these ambition gaps. The rules on Article 6 and transparency would be agreed, but with major compromises that weaken their effectiveness and raise concerns about environmental integrity. An ugly outcome would see no agreement on the remaining elements of the Paris rulebook and no real engagement at all on ways to close the ambition gap, with sharp divisions and finger pointing between countries over who needs to do more to address the climate crisis. Thank you again for this opportunity to share my thoughts with you, and I look forward to your questions.
Well, thank you very much to our witnesses for your very insightful testimony, and I recognize myself for 5 minutes for questions. It was refreshing to hear a united panel, a message from this panel that the world needs American leadership when it comes to climate. For the Congress, the best way to demonstrate that leadership is to pass the Build Back Better infrastructure and clean energy package. And we're on the cusp of doing that. So that's good news. It's also good news in a selfish way for American consumers, because we know investing in clean energy over time is going to lower costs for them. But there's a bigger picture here. As we all march to Glasgow, we're marching together with American businesses, states and local communities, scientists, innovators, farmers, churches, and the faith community. And I think the message is partly to keep the pressure on China and India and other large emitters to help them raise their level of ambition. And that's got to be part of the equation here. So Ms. Franson, what risk do you see for America if we do not assume that leadership role and follow through? And then talk to us about the opportunities for America that renewed leadership would bring.
Thank you. I'll start with opportunities, actually, because there are many. Assuming a leadership role on the climate crisis, it not only saves money for American households and businesses, as you noted, which currently spend $1 trillion per year on fossil fuels, but it reduced costs in healthcare too. In one scenario for having emissions developed by WRI and others, it was found that these actions would provide health benefits and avoid health costs to the tune of somewhere between $26 and $58 billion by 2030, not to mention the lives saved. We also can benefit from increased competitiveness. As demand for clean technologies rises, focusing on low carbon or zero carbon manufacturing rather than doubling down on yesterday's industries is what's going to give the US the advantage. So just for example, the global lithium ion battery market is projected to be $105 billion by 2025 as EVs gain traction. And as I noted, by 2030, there'll be a $23 trillion climate-related markets in emerging markets. And so if we don't pursue these clean technologies domestically and maintain and gain our competitive edge, we're going to be losing out on those opportunities. I also want to mention the job potential. In the United States, investing in renewables and energy efficiency creates more than 2.5 times as many jobs as fossil fuels per dollar invested. And investing in ecosystem restoration creates 3.7 times as many jobs per dollar invested. So that's another opportunity that we're risking losing out on if we don't take action here. Finally, I think this provides an important opportunity for rural America as well, and that's in terms of economic diversification. So wind companies are already paying farmers and other rural landowners something on the order of $220 million a year to host wind turbines. And this also generates tax revenue and other income down the value chain. And we can build on that by creating more opportunities in forest restoration, agroforestry, and regenerative agriculture. So those are the opportunities. The risk, if we don't take advantage of those, is that we just lose out on all of that. And we lose out to countries that are acting faster. China is investing more than twice as much as we are in renewable energy. I don't know why we wouldn't want to take advantage of that for ourselves. Thank you.
And thank you. And Mr. Meyer, the science tells us we don't have time to waste. Why we were focused years ago on a goal of net zero by 2050, but the latest IPCC report was a code red, and it said you better get going this decade. Talk to us about that, how important that is going into Glasgow.
Yes, thank you, Chair Castor. The report issued just yesterday by the United Nations Environment Program showed that we are on track for a 2.7 degree world, almost twice what we need to be aiming for. And emissions are going to increase by 16% by 2030 if we stay on the path we're on and countries don't take more action. By contrast, we need to cut emissions almost in half over that period to have a 66% chance of keeping below 1.5 degrees. So it is code red. We have to dramatically scale up and accelerate the transition to a clean energy future, and that's the challenge for Glasgow. Can we do it? I think that's the biggest question that will be before leaders and ministers when they gather next week in Scotland.
Well, hopefully the Congress will pass a good clean energy and infrastructure package to demonstrate America is taking a leadership role there, and we are serious about acting this decade right away. Thank you, and I'll yield now to Mr. Graves for 5 minutes for his questions. Oh, excuse me, we'll go to Ms. Miller first. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair Castor and Ranking Member Graves, and thank you all for being here today. Out of control gas prices have risen over $3 in every state at this point. Natural gas prices are surging as Europe fails to meet its own energy demands, and Russia, shockingly, holds the lever of power over our allies after our president gifted Putin a pipeline instead of promoting cleaner, safer, American-made energy. President Obama was after coal during his presidency, but now President Biden is here to finish the job, and it's not just coal that they are after. They are declaring war on American prosperity, a war on American energy independence, and a war on American working class who will bear the greatest brunt of this burden, losing their jobs, paying more for the lifestyle that Americans today have become accustomed to, like having electricity in their homes instead of candles, or taking a hot shower instead of dumping a bucket of cold water on their head. And this isn't just in America. Chair Castro, I would like to submit to you, for the record, an op-ed from the president of Uganda published in the Wall Street Journal just this past week, titled Solar and Wind Force Poverty on Africa. President Museveni writes that focusing on renewable energy projects in Africa earns praise in the US and Europe, but leaves many Africans with unreliable and expensive electricity. While our global elite are trying to rewrite the rules for the entire world, they are subjugating developing countries to destitute destinies. Affordable energy and capitalism have lifted more out of poverty than anything else. Allowing developing nations access to these resources is not only good policy, but it is also the morally right thing to do. Forcing Africa to live in poverty and darkness so that John Kerry can feel accomplished on his private jet is not only arrogant, but it's inexcusable. I'm not opposed to forms of renewable energy, but we must do it the right way. And all of the above energy policy with complements our energy producing communities instead of destroying them. And it will build a stronger energy grid, more resilient communities, and a more united country. Innovation in carbon capture technologies will mitigate the impacts of traditional energy sources without giving up American energy independence. This committee and this president must use science and technology and commit to common sense energy policies, not radical progressive idealism. Mr. Hernick, in your testimony, you explained how U.S. natural gas is much cleaner than natural gas from other foreign countries. Can you explain why U.S. gas is cleaner and how exporting more U.S. energy would actually lower global emissions?
Congresswoman Miller, for the question. And in your statement, you bring up some of the real moral issue that is associated with tackling the climate problem. And I agree with you completely. And part of what we need to rely on is better data. I think A major challenge when you look at the U.S. oil and gas sector and what's produced, these are commodities. And historically, we haven't done a good job of distinguishing what's the difference between U.S. oil and natural gas or petroleum products from other countries. But it's time that we do that. And the reason is because as the United States has grown in its economic development, we have implemented the highest environmental safeguards anywhere in the world. When I was working for U.S. Agency for International Development, folks looked to the United States for best practices on how to protect waterways and keep the air clean. We've been doing that. We've been doing that as we extract natural resources, as we mine, as we develop oil and natural gas. And that means that we have a smaller environmental footprint, and we should be very proud of that fact. I think it's part of what we need to do is tell the story to the rest of the world that there is a comparative advantage that the United States has in cleaner oil and natural gas. There's more that can be done. And part of the technologies that you talked about with related to carbon capture, utilization, and storage, these are real technologies that are being implemented right now. If you're in the Washington, D.C. area, there's a plant not too far away from here in Maryland that captures carbon dioxide. It's a coal-fired power plant. It ends up as the fizzy bubbles in a lot of drinks. Exactly. Companies are investing in how to develop everything from concrete to yoga pants that's using carbon captured from the atmosphere and integrated into consumer products. That's a great direction to be headed in, and we shouldn't close that off.
Thank you. I yield back my time.
Rep. Bonamici, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Chair Castor, and thank you to all of our witnesses. I want to note that Ranking Member Graves in his opening statement said we need to be candid and talk about reality. Here's candid and here's reality. Last summer, as Ms. Franson mentioned, there was a heat dome in the Pacific Northwest that killed hundreds. Ocean acidification is affecting our coastal communities and economies. Drought is threatening our crops and our farms, and glaciers are melting and sea level is rising. So climate change, as we know, is an existential threat. We cannot rely on the free market alone to provide a sufficient response to its worst effects. And I do want to say that I reject the notion that a fossil fuel is fine if it's so-called cleaner than another fossil fuel. A whole of government approach is necessary to meet the challenge domestically, and robust collaboration with the international community is necessary to meet that challenge. I want to ask you, Ms. Franson, could you please discuss why relying on the free market and government-supported research and development alone is not enough to meet the scale of the climate crisis?
Absolutely. So to give some context here, from 2005 to 2018, U.S. energy-related CO2 emissions fell 12%. Okay, but we need to reduce emissions more than 4 times faster as that over the next decade than we did from 2005 to 2018. So we need to be stepping on the accelerator here in a dramatic way. We can't just rely on what we've been doing in the past. And by the way, I think it's important to note as well that the declines in emissions that we've experienced to date are not only a result of the free market. We have invested significantly in tax credits for renewable energy that are responsible for the tremendous growth that we've seen in solar and wind. So even some of those gains that we've had so far, which are too little and not fast enough, are not solely the result of the free market. So I don't think that there's any evidence that suggests that if we sit back and do nothing, we will get to where we need to go. It's just not happening. We know that successful policies can make a difference, that well-designed policies and measures like those in the Build Back Better Act are a critical part of what's going to get us to our emissions goals, which, by the way, are not simply to reduce emissions marginally, like the shift from coal to natural gas does, but to virtually eliminate emissions. That's where we're going. That's what we need to keep our eyes on. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I'm going to get another question into Ms. McKenna, but I also want to note the importance in the Build Back Better and the policies that we are on the cusp of, as the chair said, passing. These policies will create hundreds, if not millions, of jobs in this country. So I wanted to note that it's so important to make sure that we send the message that when people will be able to get these great jobs in renewable energy. Ms. McKenna, thank you again for being here to discuss the work of Mercy Corps. And your testimony highlighted the effects of climate change on agriculture, including crop losses, and food insecurity. So can you please outline the importance of U.S. climate leadership to the regions and the 40 countries in which Mercy Corps operates, and explains how the U.S. should step up efforts to address global humanitarian issues that are exacerbated by the climate crisis?
Thank you so much for the question. There are a few things and a few reasons why the U.S. should step up, but the main one is that it only makes common economic sense, particularly on the adaptation front. So the inequality that we are already seeing and experiencing, and that is being worsened due to COVID, will only widen and increase without immediate attention on adaptation and money from the U.S. government. Much of that money is needed for the least developed countries. And failing to act on this will only result in a huge economic and human toll. It'll cause increases in poverty, increases in conflict, and severely undermines our long-term global prospects. So we are all aligned. The second place where the U.S. should play a strong role with U.S. companies, governments, universities, all of us, is in innovation. A lot of the increase in access to energy that we have seen in the world has been because of new technologies and renewables and other energy things. The old fossil fuel ways of bringing big power in Africa simply have not been able to come to fruition in that way. So there are a lot of opportunities to keep using those technologies and opportunities for American businesses to help people to get more sources of renewable and decentralized power. Finally, in addition to that, we need to be looking at the causes of conflict and addressing those as we look at climate change. Climate change only exacerbates conflict, and there are a lot of ways that we can work with local actors to do that. And looking at the root cause of climate is one. For example, in northern Uganda, on the border, there are pastoral communities that use rivers and other things for their livelihood. We have been able to fund work that helps those communities determine land usage rights over that water to decrease that tension between those communities and to prevent a more costly conflict in those areas. So we have a lot to bring to the table. U.S. innovation, U.S. leadership is critical for us to be successful.
Thank you so much, Ms. McKenna, for your testimony and also for the important work of Mercy Corps, and I yield back.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Graves, Ranking Member Graves, you're recognized for 5 minutes. Is he not on the screen? All right, then we'll go to Mr. Carter. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. If I could take a moment of personal privilege, I want to announce that at 11:09 a.m. at Piedmont Hospital, Mary Emma Carter, the first child of my youngest son, was born, and my 6th grandchild. So
congratulations.
Very, very happy. Thank you.
Wonderful.
Thank you. Gosh, let me start off somewhere. Ms. McKenna, thank you very much. I found your testimony, I read it, and I found it very fascinating. And I want you to know that I agree with a lot of it. I think it hits at some of the concerns that I've got. In your testimony, first of all, you say, first, it is vital to recognize that communities urgently need help to adapt to the changing climate. It is too late to focus solely on reducing emissions, and I have to agree with you there. I think that's a great point. I have the honor and privilege of representing the entire coast of Georgia, over 100 miles of pristine coastline. It's where I've lived all my life and where I intend to live the rest of my life, and it means a whole lot to me to make sure. I've always said that we have to do 3 things. We have to practice mitigation, adaptation, and innovation. And I have to give credit where credit's due. My good friend from Alabama sitting beside me was the first one to say that I heard it from, and I've been saying it ever since. And it is true. It's something I believe in. You also said that in your testimony, U.S. climate adaptation assistance should build on and reinforce our other development assistance to prevent conflict, hunger, and poverty. And I agree with you on that, too. I think that's a great point. My question, though, is this. If the developing world is forced to use renewable solar and wind energy, would it increase prosperity or simply raise cost?
Thank you for that question. I actually recently moved to the area from Georgia, so I agree with you on that pristine coastline, and I miss it. As I mentioned earlier, we have seen a steady decrease in energy poverty, and it has been mostly due to renewable energies and rapid growth in decentralized energy processes. The rapidly declining cost of those has also been enabled those usages of those. And for lower income communities, renewables may be the only real chance to end energy poverty. So we're continuing to see leapfrogging due to technology. We have things like increased financing for the REACH, ongoing innovation to meet those needs, and improved policies will allow communities to make their own choices and to do the most cost-effective things.
Would you agree? What about higher energy costs? Would higher energy costs, are they going to help to prevent conflict and hunger and poverty, or do just the opposite?
Yeah, higher energy costs are not helpful, which is why it's important to have multiple sources of energy.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. I appreciate that. Mr. Hernick, I want to go to you. I want to ask you, as you are well aware, as we're all aware, since President Biden has taken office, he's done a number of things: canceled the Keystone XL pipeline, rejoined the Paris Agreement, ended energy leases on federal land, removed sanctions on the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, encouraged OPEC to pump more oil, and we're pumping less, encouraging them to pump more. I mean, it baffles me. He's proposed taxing natural gas, penalizing the use of all fossil fuels through the SEP plan and others. First of all, I want to ask you, if all of these actions stay in place, all of them that he has taken action on so far, and the proposed ones are signed into law, will we still meet the climate goals set by the Paris Agreement?
Congressman, to achieve the climate goals set in the Paris Agreement, we need to bring the whole world along with us. And I think that that's part of the challenge, is that we cannot sacrifice the U.S. economy to achieve these goals alone. We need to take it with a global view on how we can reduce emissions the most, bring people out of poverty, meet their energy security needs, and do it while growing jobs and economic opportunity here in the United States. Some of those proposals that you mentioned will deploy more renewables here in the United States. But this morning I met with the Minnesota Chamber of Commerce and some folks from Twin Metals, Minnesota, that came in, and they're going to be unable to produce and open a mine in northern Minnesota that's adjacent to the Boundary Waters, a beautiful area that we want to preserve and protect. But if we're not able to mine and develop critical minerals and resources in the United States, we're going to fail to meet what is an economic growth opportunity here too. And so that's where an all of the above approach is absolutely necessary.
Great. And how effective has the Paris Agreement been on reducing emissions in other countries and global emissions as a whole?
Not at all. Not at all. Not at all effective. And I think that that's an important thing to recognize, is that even President Obama's Clean Power Plan that never came into being set a goal, and the United States achieved that goal without the mandate 10 years ahead of schedule. And that's because of federal policy as it relates to tax incentives, federal policy as it relates to innovation, a lot of state action, and the action of corporate America. And that's something I do want to talk a lot about. There are many, many companies, electric power utilities, that are driving emissions down, headed to net zero. One statistic that I'll leave you all with is that right now, 75% of American households are served by an energy utility that's on the path to net zero by mid-century. We don't need mandates if utilities are interested in heading in this direction already. 75% of Americans.
Great point. Thank you, and I yield back.
Ms. Brownlee, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Meyer, I wanted to ask you, and I apologize if I'm repeating a question that I didn't hear previously, and I apologize for being late. But in your testimony, you stated, geopolitical tensions, especially between the United States and China, and there's, a dynamic at play, certainly going on. Do you believe there are meaningful areas where the U.S. Could engage with China related to international climate policy, where we could find some significant agreement? And if so, which areas would you recommend the administration focus on in negotiations?
Thank you, Representative. Yes, there are some areas. It is a very tense relationship. We're not going to agree on everything. China absolutely has to do much more if we're going to have any chance of staying at 1.5, even below 2 degrees Celsius. We have been collaborating with China in some areas on clean energy technology. In the Major Economies Forum process over the years, the U.S. and China have been chairing the Sustainable Finance Working Group in the G20, which recently put forward a sustainable finance roadmap, which was adopted by finance ministers, including Secretary Yellen, earlier this month. So there are areas where we can collaborate. We also have to recognize we're competitive rivals for the growing markets for clean energy technologies. And as others have stated, China is winning that race right now in terms of renewable energy, in terms of storage, in terms of electric vehicles and other technologies. We're going to compete there, and we know that, but we can play in a world that's dominated by rules and norms and standards that drives innovation and drives technology deployment of clean technologies. And if we can reach agreement with China on that, rather than competing sets of rules and norms, we'll be ahead of the game.
Thank you for that. And I wanted to just follow up on the line of questioning that's already taken place here. But, you know, it's ironic that we're here talking about this and, you know, behind closed doors, we're trying to figure out how to get to close to $1 trillion worth of investment in climate on the U.S.'s part. And so this is really a question for all of you. So if we can reach that agreement, and I believe we will ultimately, but, you know, we're not there yet. How does that play? I mean, it's got to help. I know that, but, you know, does it help a little? Does it help a lot? I'm just sort of curious where people stand on that relative to COP26 and our leadership and, you know, getting the planet to a place where we need to get it.
Let me start because I spoke to that in my testimony. I'm sure others will come in. It's essential that the U.S. does what it says, that we walk the talk, and that we show we're going to do everything we can to reach the 50 to 52% reduction target that President Biden announced in April at the Leader Summit he hosted. That is the most effective strategy, frankly, to put pressure on China and other countries who are questioning our political will and whether we stand behind what we put forward in the global community. So I certainly hope that we will be able to show in Glasgow that we're making progress in that direction. Obviously, what Congress does is essential, but the administration has a number of other tools in its toolbox in terms of financial standards, regulations, loan guarantees of the Department of Energy, working with the growing number of states and governors and mayors and business leaders and investors who have demonstrated that they really want to take the lead in the world economy on clean energy deployment. They've set goals of net zero, 100% renewables. We can do a lot more to collaborate with them and encourage more to join them in this drive for climate survival.
Well, I can assure you that that's exactly what the president told us this morning. So you and he are on the same page on that. Any other comments from the panelists? McKenna?
I'd love to come in.
Oh, I apologize. Yes, please.
Was that for me?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. I would echo everything that Mr. Meyer just said. I think the international community is well aware of the importance of this legislation in the US delivering on its commitment to reduce emissions by 50 to 52%. And I've heard members of this committee talking about whether we can trust China on this issue. I should underscore that China is on track to deliver its existing pledges, which is not something that the United States can yet say. And moreover, the United States has a history of reneging on its international climate commitments, unfortunately, having pulled out of the Kyoto Protocol and subsequently the Paris Agreement. So we need to do a lot to restore our trust, and this legislation is a big part of that. Thank you.
Thank you. And with that, Madam Chair, I yield back.
Thank you very much. Mr. Gonzalez, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I want to quickly mention that China has no binding commitment to meet any target. So it's easy to meet something that you don't have a binding commitment to achieve. That said, there is a suggestion today that it's a lack of will or somehow a lack of ambition that prevents climate action. My view is it's a lack of realism in many respects with respect to the trade-offs that different countries are going to have to make, certainly a lack of global coordination, and also a lack of appropriate technology. The developed nations, notably Germany, that have moved sort of full on into solar and wind, have the highest rates in the developed world, certainly in Europe, and have not achieved their climate targets. A lot of that has to do with the fact they keep shutting down nuclear plants, which makes no sense to me, and the backup generation is coal. Another fact or projection, roughly 75% of all births globally over the next 50 years will occur in Africa. Those are fossil-based economies today. Mr. Hernick, I want to start with you because I think you have the key line in your testimony, which is low cost, low emissions technologies and goods will be critical to successful climate policy. Anything short of widespread adoption will fail to address this global issue. So as you look at a world where 75% of births will take place in a continent that is largely driven by fossil, how do we get to our targets if not through low-cost technologies?
Thank you for the question, Congressman. And in my time in Africa, when I read the editorial, the article from the president of Uganda that Congresswoman Miller presented, it is very powerful. And I think that we have to remember, and I say this as an environmentalist, that there is no greater threat to the environment than poverty. Because if folks are in a position where they need to choose for their family to heat their home and use a fossil fuel, use hydropower, use solar power, or go out and cut down a tree and deforest, they'll go out and cut down the tree and deforest. And I think that that's a major challenge that you're seeing across the continent. Widespread deforestation, which makes it actually more difficult to adapt to a changing environment. So we need all of the above resources available to countries, and that will include opportunities to retrofit their coal-fired power plants, use not just carbon capture, utilization, and storage, but other innovative technologies that do allow fuel switching from coal to I met with a company called Easy Energy Systems. They're based out of Iowa. And they provide a technology where you can supplement the fuel that goes into a coal-fired power plant and reduce emissions dramatically. That's a cool technology. Yep. If we're not developing that here, it won't be available in Africa.
Thank you. Ms. Franson, in your testimony, you advocated for more investment in clean technology and a reduction in the rate of deforestation by 70%. I mentioned in our hearing last week that I have significant concerns about biodiversity and deforestation associated with solar and wind. A study conducted in California that was published in the National Academy of Sciences found that the deployment of solar panels can exacerbate habitat fragmentation, that's obvious, result in direct and indirect ecological consequences. And another study led by Clark University found that forest removal in New England and New York for the construction of solar farms has driven up carbon emissions, releasing close to 5 million metric tons of carbon annually in recent years. These sorts of things are common sense. When you destroy forests and natural habitats, you emit carbon, lose carbon storage, and disrupt sensitive ecosystems. How do we strike the right balance between ecological concerns and climate concerns when it comes to massive amount of land needed for solar and wind?
Thank you for the question. I think before I address it, I want to note that China and the US have exactly the same amount of legal bindingness in their targets under the Paris Agreement. That's a feature that the US negotiated very hard for. Moving on to your question. I think fortunately it is not necessary to destroy forests and biodiversity to deploy solar and wind energy. I spoke earlier about how farmers are benefiting from payments to put wind turbines on their land, and that's helping them economically without destroying any forests. We have many options to deploy solar, for example, on rooftops in urban areas and in less ecologically sensitive areas. So of course we need to do it intelligently, and of course there need to be safeguards in place for biodiversity, but I think those two things can easily go hand in hand. Thank you.
If you project how much solar is required to hit some of these targets, and you just look at where you'll have to deploy it, I think reasonableness would suggest that that's not true, but I'll yield back.
Next up, Congressman Caston, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to our witnesses. I want to just make a comment. My friend from Ohio just made the point that China has no binding commitments, and it's true. None of us do. The way that Paris was structured was to have voluntary non-binding commitments to create a framework for all of us to try to build to something more permanent. We are uniquely the only country that looked at voluntary non-binding commitments and decided that was too hard. And so Trump pulled out. Now, I share that because when we were in Madrid, shortly after being pulled out, many of us on this committee, one of the Europeans pulled me aside and he said, I just want to let you know that bad things happen when the United States doesn't lead. And that is the moment that we are in by conscious choice of the former president. And frankly, by conscious choice of 40 years of policy where our story to the world has been, let me tell you about the complexities of the US Senate. That's on all of us. For us to lead, we need to have the economic muscle to do that. Check, we got it. We need to be the leading advocate in the world for equity and equality and democracy. Check, we've got that box. And then we need to show that we have actions to match our words. And we have failed at that for 40 years. Now, I share that background because we've had those two of the three. There are other countries in the world that have at least one of those and are trying to come up with two, but they can't match our commitment to democracy. And Mr. Meyer, you've been at this as long as anybody, certainly on the panel, maybe as long as anybody in this room. As I look back over history, the last time that the United States actually led and had all three of those was when the Montreal Protocol was structured. I would point out under the Reagan and first Bush White House. I wonder if you could just share your wisdom of what we did right when we put that together and what we are missing in the current political zeitgeist in America to do what we did before when we did fix a problem, right? What can you share with us?
Thank you, Congressman. Let me first try to clarify this issue of bindingness. The Paris Agreement is binding on all countries to put forward what are called nationally determined contributions. So it's bottom up. Each country decides what they can do and they commit to do it. And it is binding on every country to report on how well they are doing in meeting those commitments. It is not binding on all countries to meet those commitments because of the United States Senate. Because if the agreement had required each country to meet those commitments, it would have required submitting it to the Senate for ratification. And President Obama knew there were not 67 votes in the Senate to ratify. So the reason it's not binding to meet the commitments is because of the United States. On the Montreal Protocol, that is a success story. It really has worked very well. And it was driven by science, including by Maggie Thatcher, who was the conservative prime minister of England at the time of the United Kingdom. And she persuaded President Reagan to support a negotiation of the Montreal Protocol. That being said, it is a much easier problem to solve because it deals with a much smaller set of economic actors. And those economic actors realized two things. One, they could make a lot of money by producing the alternatives to the substances that were destroying the stratospheric ozone layer. And two, if their products did destroy the stratospheric ozone layer, they could be on the hook for a lot of lawsuits and a lot of liability and compensation. So we were able to work with business, with other countries to get that in place. It is a good model, but it's not entirely analogous because of the differences. We have to mobilize action across every sector of the economy. Every major country needs to participate. And as we've heard, it's a much tougher problem than the ozone.
Well, I know I'm close to time. I guess I would just offer that and I agree with all those points, but a lot of that framework was then adopted into the 1990 amendments to the Clean Air Act, which we did for acid rain, which had a different set of economics. But we have shown with U.S. leadership that we can create a cap and trade model to monetize the reduction of environmental. And with the time I got left, Ms. Franzen, converting to clean energy is converting to cheap energy. So much of what we're trying to do in the Build Back Better is to make sure that we deploy the capital so that people can benefit from cheap energy. And whether that's building out EV charging stations or tax credits, we've at least thought about how to do that in the United States. If you have a solar panel on your roof, you don't pay for electricity anymore. It's pretty awesome. If you have an electric vehicle, you don't pay for gasoline anymore. It's pretty awesome. Everybody who tells you that we can't afford to do this basically would fail a freshman capital budgeting class, but I digress. What, Mrs. Franzen, should we be thinking about internationally to make sure that folks in other countries also have access to those capital deployments so that they can benefit from cheap, clean energy?
Thank you. I think, first of all, as has already been underscored, the role of the US in leading on innovation on these technologies to get them to exist in the first place. And second, on deployment to have economies of scale bring costs down is fundamentally critical. So I would start there. And beyond that, I think the kind of support for countries, especially poor countries, a number of folks have experience in Africa and in much less developed contexts. Support for those countries in the form of climate finance is also a critical part of the equation. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you, Madam Chair, for allowing us to go a little over. I yield back.
Next up, Representative Palmer, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
I thank the chairman and the witnesses for being here. And I want to thank my colleague from California for acknowledging publicly what we've known all along, that this legislation is being developed behind closed doors with zero input from Republicans, which is hardly the way to address major issues. I also want to commend Mr. Meyer for the work his organization has done in regard to an issue that is kind of the ugly truth behind the climate, the push for renewables, and that is your organization acknowledged that there's 9,700 excess deaths in the UK because of energy poverty. The prices for household energy has gone up so much in the UK that people can't afford to keep their homes adequately cooled, and they're dying from cold-related illnesses. Same thing's true in Scotland. It's interesting that a lot of my colleagues are going to be in Scotland. Maybe they should take some warm blankets with them because they're going to go through the same thing. And if this bill passes, we're already, without this bill passing, because of the Biden administration's energy policies already, we're anticipating somewhere in the range of a 40% increase in household utility cost, which is going to really be problematic for people in some of the states like New York and Pennsylvania and New Jersey and Michigan, and particularly problematic for elderly people because many of these people are on fixed incomes. They're going to have to make decisions about how much they can spend on their utilities to keep their homes adequately warm versus what they can spend on their food, which the food prices are going through the roof, what they can spend on the medicines that they need. And we've already seen Democrat policies in those states in regard to the elderly and COVID and the thousands of people who died because of their policies in nursing homes. I just think the American people need to wake up and see what's happening here. I also have some real issues with this discussion about China. China said their target is to stop increasing emissions by 2030. To stop increasing emissions. They're going to continue to increase emissions until 2030. And frankly, the entire Chinese culture is built on deception. So I don't believe for a minute that they're going to stop it because their objective is not to save the planet. It is to rule the planet. So all of you sitting at that table are living in a strange world. I just am taken aback by the science. You keep talking about the science and try to say that the science is settled. Well, the only science that's settled is the political science on your side. You talked about 2.7 degree Celsius increase in climate. Even the people who talk about greenhouse gases increasing the climate admitted that 2.7 degrees will have a negligible impact on the planet. It may actually increase economic development. It will increase food production. And then for those who are talking about food, the World Bank put out a report when the big push was for biofuels. Mr. Hernick, you may recall this. That report was suppressed because what they found is it increased food prices globally by about 75%, and it forced 100 million people into poverty and probably, I want to say, in the 40 million range into food poverty, into hunger. You've got, I want to say, 5 times the number of people living in developing countries as live in developed countries. and you want to deny them access to natural resources like natural gas that could pull those people out of poverty. The World Bank has said that that there are more people dying from indoor pollution than from anything related to the climate. So you're condemning people to poverty. You're condemning people potentially to shorter lifespans because of these policies. I think you need to think about this. And you talk about jobs. We had a meeting with the Vice President of the European Union who admitted to us that the people who lost their jobs in fossil fuel industry did not get new jobs. They're now having to live on their Social Security. And there's a Spanish study that showed that for every renewable job created, they lost 2.2 jobs. Those are some things that I think need to be on the table. With that, Madam Chairman, I yield back.
Next up, Representative Crenshaw, welcome. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you for holding this hearing. Thank you to all the witnesses for being here. Ms. Franson, I'd like to start with you. You pointed to China as a leader in renewable energy investment. They've also asked that we help fund their transition to green energy. My question is, should we do that?
Thank you. China has been supportive of the U.S. providing international climate finance in accordance with our commitment under the Paris Agreement. That funding is particularly necessary for vulnerable and poor countries for a combination of mitigation and increasingly.
I understand that it may be necessary for a combination of poor countries, but would it be necessary for China? It's not a trick question.
Well, we need to continue providing that finance and increase that finance in accordance with our obligation under the Paris Agreement.
Sure. Well, I hope China's never a recipient of that. I mean, you've mentioned them multiple times as a leader in renewable energy, saying multiple times that they have invested at least double the amount the U.S. has in renewable investments. If you're impressed by that, you'll be very impressed with what they've invested in coal. In 2020, China built 3 times more new coal capacity than the entire world combined. It's the equivalent of 1 new large coal plant per week. And that's on top of the 73 gigawatts of new coal capacity that's planned, but not completed yet. So they're not going to COP26, and they should not be hailed as some leader in climate policy. Ms. Franson, change of the subject. You mentioned in your testimony that the United States needs to drastically reduce the rate of deforestation. Really no disagreement there. I'm not so sure that we have a high rate of deforestation. You didn't cite where you got that number, but that's not important. I think we all want net more trees. So let's agree on that. But what we might not agree on is who we should be hailing as leaders throughout the world. Many of the countries you mention as leaders in the climate space, they burn trees for electricity in order to meet their climate goals. The EU uses biofuels for 45% of its quote unquote renewable mix. Do you think the United States should follow suit? Do you think we should be speaking out against these countries that use wood burning as a way to make their renewable energy mix sound better?
Yeah, thank you for raising that. There are certainly problematic uses of biofuels throughout the world. Not all biofuels are sustainable, and not all forms of biofuels can be a robust part of our climate change solution. And that's why we need to be investing in other forms of clean renewable energy like wind and solar. We also need to bear in mind that biofuel production can come into competition with conserving forests for carbon sequestration and biodiversity. And that's the form of biofuels that we need to avoid. So absolutely, we should call that out.
Good. I'm glad to hear that. I would also note that CO2 emissions for wood burning are 2.5 times higher than natural gas. We should not be clapping our hands for our European partners that like to burn biofuels instead of just going to clean natural gas that's produced in the U.S. I would also note that natural gas produced by the United States is 41% less emissions on a life cycle basis than gas produced in Russia. And yet our administration plus the Europeans are doing everything they can to rely on Russian natural gas instead. I find that to be very frustrating. Another frustration I might have is, because I have many, we have countries like Uganda, they're begging for more natural gas. They're telling the Western world that they won't be trapped in this generational poverty because of the less obsession with only solar and wind solutions. There's a company in my district that is trying to build an LNG import terminal in Vietnam. The LNG terminal would allow them to wean off of Chinese coal, which is 3 times the emissions profile of US natural gas. And in Vietnam, their population density is 800 people per square mile. So a solar farm displaces quite a few people. It's not really feasible for them. So they're asking for cleaner energy that actually works for them. Wind doesn't work for them because offshore is closer to Chinese waters. And yet the Biden administration is refusing to permit this. It's refusing to allow this because our policy is not to help fund any kind of projects, fossil fuel projects abroad. But of course, this is just going to lead to higher emissions. Much like many of these policies will end up net leading to higher emissions. It's worth noting that if all OECD countries right now stopped burning fossil fuels, stopped emitting any carbon dioxide whatsoever, all of them right now for the next 100 years, we would only reduce the temperature by 2100 by 0.8 degrees Fahrenheit. It's quite a huge cost for almost no benefit whatsoever. I only point that out to get us back to some kind of rational thinking when it comes to a cost-benefit analysis and how we might look for better solutions that reduce emissions, because I think we all have the same goal there, but do so in a more pragmatic way. Thank you. I yield back.
Well, I want to thank our witnesses for your testimony today. Your testimony comes at a vital moment for Americans and the human race, frankly. Congress is poised to act on the historic Build Back Better infrastructure and clean energy package. That's good news for American families because it's going to lower costs, provide cleaner air, good paying jobs across the economy. And we know that Americans are awake like never before to the rising costs and the impacts of the climate crisis. Just take a look at what we're shelling out for catastrophic weather events now that are escalating. We have got to get a handle on this. Americans want action. And with American leadership will come global action that we need desperately we have to act because temperatures are continuing to rise and it's going to get worse unless we all act. So we're going to march together to Glasgow and do everything we can to help President Biden achieve our goals and press the rest of the world to do so as well. So without objection, I'd like to enter into the record at this time an October 2021 report from the World Resources Institute titled The State of Climate 2021. The executive summary of an October 2021 report from the United Nations Environment Program titled The Heat is On, a World of Climate Promises Not Yet Delivered, which provides an overview of the difference between where greenhouse gas emissions are predicted to be in 2030 and where they should be to avert the worst impacts of climate change. 3, a September 2021 report from the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development titled Climate Finance Provided and Mobilized by Developed Countries, which examines the gap between adaptation financing that has been provided and what is needed. And finally, a September 17, 2021 letter from the Industrial Energy Consumers of America, because of course exporting oil and methane has repercussions for the U.S. economy. So this letter to Department of Energy Secretary Granholm asked the DOE to take action to prevent a U.S. methane supply crunch that would harm consumers. The letter notes that low storage levels are the result of higher year-over-year exports. Without objection, those will be entered into the record. I thank you again for attending our hearing. On to Glasgow. The hearing is adjourned.